Good morning, folks. Thanks for joining. I think we can I'll get started with an introduction, and we'll probably have a few more folks joining us as we go along. Again, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And thanks to all of those who are doing that. So my name is Lauren Brady. I work with the Vermont Council on Rural Development, which hosts these series of workshops for the Vermont Community Leadership Network. And the Community Leadership Network is open to everyone, and its purpose is to connect and support local leaders as they build projects, organizations, and systems to serve their own communities, as well as to serve Vermont's urgent or long-term needs. The network holds workshops like this one, and there's a whole library we'll point you to online. And it also has some other resources you might want to check out, like the leadership guide, which helps. It's a whole series of tools and resources that you can connect to advance your projects. Today's workshop, hosted by Amy, is Pointing to Hope, looking at resilience, coping, and caring for our communities. And the reason that we wanted to hold this workshop is that after last year's floods and then this year's floods, starting on the anniversary of last year's floods and continuing through the summer, we were seeing our role from last year in convening folks who were working on flood recovery shifting a little bit. You know, a lot of those folks had last year's experience under their belt, and they might be looking for a different sort of support. So at VCRD, we were thinking about what is the support that we can offer as people are experiencing these layered crises, these layered floods, one on top of the other. And one of the things we were hearing most right away was a sense of hopelessness, and that came from such a similar flood happening right 1 year later, as well as the December floods of last year, and yeah, just this sense of frustration and hopelessness. And another thing we heard about flood fatigue right away. And Eliza West is an artist who did this graphic she's calling Trauma Ramen. And so there were just a lot of stories of how we're all dealing with the mental and emotional toll of all these things happening on top of each other. So we were thinking about who we could turn to help us build up our toolkit to support our mental health. And Amy was with us for a workshop last November, mental health and community well-being, that was targeted towards flood recovery as well. And she just did such a great job and had such an important perspective with communities around the country that we wanted to bring her back and ask her to do a more full training on the work that she does and what she's learned over the years. So yeah, so this is really for anybody who's, you know, dealing with a spectrum of coping, grieving, and caring for yourself and others while doing urgent and hard work on different scales. And before I turn it over to Amy, a few housekeeping pieces. First of all, I really want to thank the Vermont Community Foundation, who partnered with us at the Vermont Council for Rural Development to fund this workshop. So that was really appreciated. And then a couple other housekeeping pieces include that we'll ask you to stay muted until or unless Amy calls on you during the workshop. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat and I will spot them and let Amy know. And at the end of the workshop, Amy will also open it up for questions and you can raise your hand to be called on or put it in the chat, both work. And then remember that this will be recorded to be shared with the VCLN network and on the library of workshops that's on our website. And please feel free to also share any resources you know of that you think other folks would benefit from in the chat. I think those are all the housekeeping pieces. Jenna, is there anything you want to add? Okay, great. Amy, I'll hand it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. It's just an honor to be here, to see some familiar names from last year, and just take an opportunity to create some space for us to talk about what we at Vibrant are seeing in communities that are dealing with not just one, but multiple events. And, I think specifically you all having to face the reality of a similar event almost exactly at the same time. And so wanted to approach this conversation from two places. One from an opportunity for you to kind of exhale and create some space for yourself, but also just to give you some anchored data around what is to be expected when you're working in communities that have experienced, layering or significant numbers of incidences within a short period of time. So it's meant to be a toolkit ad for you. And any of all of these slides will be shared with you later, from what I understand. So don't feel the need to write down everything that you see, but they will be shared. And I did want to invite you all, because we will need just one set of tools for this. If you do have a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil or writing utensil nearby, we have a short exercise at the end that I would love for you to partake in, either now or after it ends. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully not be distracting. Are you all comfortable with the visual there in terms of what you can see? I can also make it a little bit bigger if helpful. Someone can just, okay, all right. So I'm gonna go up here like this. All right. So first of all, who am I? I'm the Director of Disaster Services at Vibrant Emotional Health. I've been involved in disaster mental health now for almost 15, 16 years in different capacities. I'm not a clinician, so I want to say that straight out. I am not a social worker or counselor, but I have been around people doing really great mental, emotional well-being care for the last 2 decades, and have been involved in kind of the practical nature of the work, because I know a lot of times when people hear behavioral or mental health, either that there's like a switch in our brain that's just like, it's not about me, I'm not really interested, or there's like a disconnect that happens. And so I want to just communicate that I really do understand that on the very basic level. There, we are busy, time is full, and it is hard for us to create space for our minds and hearts in moments like this. So just want to acknowledge that as we're walking through today. I did want to offer some grounding rules for this time, to acknowledge that this is a safe space if you allow it to be, and allow it to be for others as well as yourself. I want to just ask for respect of one another. If there is somebody speaking or sharing a piece of information, that we create that space. And if you are feeling particularly triggered by something that is being shared, please feel free to walk away from the computer and turn off your screen and take a minute, because we don't need to have folks, we don't need to expose people to things that may be triggering for them. I also want to just emphasize the confidentiality here. Like, you all are a part of this really great community of learners and community members, and what is shared here we will hold for this group. I want to also acknowledge that this is a trauma-informed space. So our team at Vibrant, any training we do comes from a perspective of each one of us are human beings with beautiful stories, complex stories that involve schedules and relationships and challenges that we're all coming to this place with. And so we're going to create a sense of peace here in communication, and just acknowledging that none of us are perfect and all of us are facing things right now. So in my team meetings, I call this a big umbrella of grace. So there's no expectation on anyone to perform or do or say things. Leads to my next piece. That participation, while I do recommend it, it is always voluntary. So I'm not gonna call you out to share your experiences. I'm not going to call names. If there is a silence after I do ask a question and ask for feedback, I'm cool with it. I don't mind sitting with it for a minute and then we can move on. So I don't want you to feel that it is awkward. I don't see it as such. Sometimes people need that extra moment just to orient themselves to what's ahead. And as I said, please take care of yourself. Drink some water, use the restroom if you need to. We have about an hour together today to talk through some topics that are helpful, but it can be challenging. So before we get started, I do want to do something that I personally have found to be very helpful, which is something called box breathing. So how many of you, just maybe by show of hands on your screen, are familiar with this? Yeah, I see many of you. Awesome. So you can either turn your screen off or keep it on. It's up to you. I'll keep mine on just so you can use me as a cue. But what I would like to do before we actually begin the breathing exercise is wherever you are seated, I'd like for you to be aware of where your feet are. So feel it. I know it might sound weird, but feel each one of your toes on the ground and then feel your heel. And then I'd like you to just take your shoulders and roll them back into the seat. And if you find that the tip of your tongue is sitting at the top of your mouth, let it fall for a minute. And then we're going to breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, and then exhale. We'll do the first two, I'll do it guided, and the last two, I'll just do a prompt for you as we move into this. So let's start together. You can close your eyes and keep them open, whatever is most comfortable for you. So inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold it, 3, and exhale. Do that again. Inhale, 2, 3, 4, hold it, 2, 3, and exhale for that full 4 seconds. Now this time I'd like you to breathe in for those 4 seconds. And when you hold it, keep in mind something that's been causing you stress recently. And exhale that stress out. 2, 3. For this final one, I'd like you to think of a person or a situation that has given you deep gratitude over the last couple of days. Breathe in that image. 2, 3, 4. Hold it in that place of joy. And exhale the gratitude. Okay, you open your eyes. Note the way your head feels. Note the way that your body feels. When we take these moments, whether it be individually in our own meditative practice or as a part of team connection, it level sets us. And that is really important when we're dealing with challenging moments as an organization or as a team. So as we move into today's exercise and training, I wanted to just outline kind of where I'd like for us to be at the end, and would love your input, obviously, and hoping that we can get there. So identifying at least 3 key impacts of layering disasters. Describe at least 3 ways of maintaining a regulated approach to your work. And then identify 3 key strategies to ensure your own resilience and wellness and self-care in light of all that you have been through. And that's where we're headed today. And with that, we'll dive in. I'd like for you, if you're interested, you scan this QR code. I'm going to be referencing pieces of a framework that our team over the last few years have put together and refined to help build on an existing understanding, which is a little bit limited, I would say, that disasters have a beginning, middle, and an end, that it's linear, and then either some waves of impact in different phases and things like that, which we do see, but it's not the full picture. So in this framework, it should be fairly scrollable on your phone, there are 2 sections that I want to call attention to that I think really do help maybe give a visual to some of what you all have been experiencing over the last couple of years. when we are thinking about the care of a community, we call this the community balance sheet. It's important for us to understand that even though we are moving through these phases of a disaster, we're not just dealing with one at any given time. Believe it or not, I know we're in 2024 now, but many of us in our communities are still dealing with the impacts, the initial acute impacts and chronic impacts of um, the pandemic. And it shifted a lot of things for us. It created a whole bunch of new rhythms that required some systematic changes that some of us are still becoming used to. It's limited our workforce, it shifted the economy. But bringing it to present day, as a nation, we are in an election year, which I'm sure you are faced in your own families with the division that occurs between which is both parties, but also perhaps relationships in your faith practice that have been ostracized and polarized because of different commitments and beliefs. Um, so that is an additional moment of crisis and interruption that we have to consider when we're thinking about the impact on our community. And that doesn't even begin to touch the immediate incidences that you all have faced over the last 2 years of recovering from floods that traditionally have not been a part of Vermont's story. And then moving into a second year where it has become yet again. So when we look at the visual of this, recognizing that people's responses and communities' resiliency is based off of the fact that we're dealing with multiple things at once. And I know that might feel very like, well, no, duh, Amy, like obviously we're dealing with multiple things at once. But I think that when we enter the room with that understanding, even at the very basic level of our partner in life, but our children, but our neighbors and our collaborating partners, it gives us a better understanding of how to care for one another, and how to zoom out a little bit and recognize that, even though there's work to be done, we as humans entering this space are coming with this understanding that these layering moments do impact our ability to heal. They limit it, they challenge it. And I think just saying that out loud sometimes gives us a pause and changes a little bit of our pacing and gives us some grace for one another as we enter in. I'm going to move into the next piece of it and recognizing that I'm not going to read this, but when we think about the different kind of people in the room in these different phases of a disaster or crisis, we've got our responders, we've got our community leaders like you all, and we've got our survivors. And it's not, we all intersect too. You might be all three, you might be two, you might, consider yourself as one. But these are just some opportunities for us to think about how to mitigate stress as these events occur. So when we're in the anticipation phase, highlighting people that have demonstrated adaptation and strength within their community and give them places of and platforms to help rally and support others.
Hey,
For
Amy.
community leaders, being really clear about what our messages are to our partners and to the greater community, to ensure that folks are ready for what might be coming. And
Amy, could you share your screen at full screen? Folks
yeah,
are finding this a little small.
of course, no problem. Give me a moment. How's that? Does that work better for folks?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you for
better.
calling that out. I appreciate
Yeah.
that, Lauren. Um, when we're responders and we're active in those disaster response places or in those crisis places, making sure that we're intentional about capturing the lessons learned from other communities, not in talking to one another to understand how we could prepare for events ourselves. I'm realizing there's some text that got left off in that playing section, but that's okay. Well, but this chart, which again, you can find on the website, outlines a few pieces just ideas of ways to move through stress in these different phases. When we're in that impact phase, creating space for people to cope. And I think when we talk about impact, there's that acute moment of when the event happens, but there is that residual impact that occurs that could be up for that really leads into the way that folks grieve and process. And it's not just isolated to that moment. I've had lots of conversations recently with community leaders that talk about, well, we should be over this by now, or I should be over this by now, because it's a year out and, my house is put back together, sort of. I'm still dealing with the insurance guy, but and we don't give ourselves permission to feel the weight of what we've walked through. And that at times can have actual physical implications of how we heal and how we walk through things. So I'll move to this next slide to talk through that. So this is from Stress First Aid. I don't know if some of you have heard of this, but there are different kind of iterations of this, but I've really liked this as markers for when should we be concerned for ourselves and for others. When you're in a healthy, regulated place, or a whole and regulated place, we talk about, obviously sleep, relationships, a sense of hope and mission are good indicators of how somebody is doing. When we are reacting to stress, even if it's just at a minimal level, I know for me, when I have stressful situations at work, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with that in my mind. I might be exhausted or feeling very muted in my ability to look forward. But anyway, so these are all used for indicators of how you may be experiencing stress, and to use them as markers for yourself to step back and recharge. And that could, at times, and I do know this, feels impossible. But I say this a lot to the people that I work with, is that the first company and organization that you work for is your name incorporated. So Amy Inc., Jenna, Lauren Inc., like that's who we work for first. So if our home company is struggling, is taxed, paying attention to ways to fill in and connect with people to create a healthier sleeping environment actually allows us to be more effective in achieving the mission that we've all set out to do in our hearts. So it's important for us to use these indicators of, man, why am I so tired? Or I'm not sleeping really well. I'm having these crazy nightmares. Like, what do I need to do to fill myself a little bit? And this doesn't always look like a run to Starbucks or, a shopping spree or things like that. It actually looks like connecting to that person that loves you deeply and it has been safe for you. If you don't have an identified person like that right now in your life, because that is the reality of some people right now, connecting to a kind therapist who could guide you and help you reestablish some sense of community. So a lot of times we hear about self-care and wellness and we check out because we've got too much to do to pay attention to that. But I would argue that even just a walk outside could allow you to be the most effective person in your mission that you have been made to be, and to actually use some of these indicators in yourself. And as you are caring for other people, to not just let it go if they're all of a sudden a little bit more irritable, or you're realizing that, their even their hygiene is decreasing. Pay attention and know what tools in your community are available. And I'll just share that 988 often is touted as the suicide prevention lifeline, but it's not just about suicide. It could be about crisis, and to have somebody available who knows how to de-escalate a situation with you, with a friend. These are the resources that are free and available 24/7. So, okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about grief. So just for definitions purposes, we define grief as the cognitive, emotional, and functional behavioral responses to death and or loss. Bereavement is the fact of that loss, and it can often be used as interchangeable. Mourning is what we would call the behavioral manifestation of grief. It's usually influenced by, our own social and cultural rituals. We often have the visual of a funeral when we think about mourning, but that's not always the case. It could be, a flower set up on the site of an accident. It can be an image that is put up as a memorial for an individual. And then there's also what we would say complicated grief. We often think about kind of in general, when it becomes complicated, it's a challenge in the transition between the acute grief of loss and then what we would call integrated grief. It really doesn't happen often, but it does occur in about 10% of bereaved people. And this is actually something that is diagnosed by a therapist and can be supported by different treatments and medications at times. But I did want to just call your attention to the term integrated, because a lot of times and I think we've even heard it in the public sphere, where we have phases of grief or stages of grief. And I think that gives us the impression that it's like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and then it's a linear movement forward. But it is actually integrated into our lives. So it's expected for the presence of this grief to be a part of a new reality for us. A friend of mine who lost her husband very early in life, she talks about it as kind of like the radio in the background. At times it's turned down low and you don't actually always have control of the volume, but at times it's cranked up out of nowhere, triggered by somebody or something. But it is never gone. And I think that that's important to realize, that it's something that can be woven into the tapestry of your life and not always seen as something negative or heavy, but as a thread that now becomes a part of your story, because it is good for us to experience. It demonstrates the humanity in ourselves. We experience this sense of grief, which can be sadness, but it can come across as other things as well. So we talk about 2 forms of grief here. There's that acute grief, which usually occurs in the early aftermath of loss. And it's that time period where we, I think as a society, give ourselves permission for things to be completely off routine. All things stop, all things change. And it can look, again, it's very individualized in terms of the way that it manifests. Integrated or abiding. And it's basically what I said, is it can be associated with sadness and long suffering, but it's not always iterated in that way. And as I mentioned, so complicated or traumatic grief, that just is grief that doesn't resolve. And there needs to be intervention to help folks get back to any sense of normal or routine. And I use normal very lightly, recognizing that that is not a word we say a lot. So we don't often acknowledge, a lot of these. But these are some of, we talk about death a lot this morning. Retirement could be something that causes grief, a sudden stop of work. Our childhood has a role in our grief, relationships, dreams that don't get realized, our financial situation, our own health, even when we do have a sense of autonomy, that maybe was a little bit preemptive. Definitely when it comes to community loss as well. We talk about these factors that influence our grief is, how close are we? And, in communities like Vermont, I know that many of the populations are quite small. So one individual death in a community has a significant impact on the rhythm of a community. That one person's no longer at the regular watering hole. And that's very real, even though they may not be your personal family member. Even just seeing a person and then all of a sudden not seeing them has impact on your life, and it is okay. And it's to be expected. And it also these elements too, like what support systems do you have? How connected are you to your own spiritual practice? What is your current life situation, your age and physical health? All of these do have impacts on the weight that grief may have. This will be in the link, but I think it's also helpful sometimes to recognize the full story, as I've said it a lot, but like our personal history affects our work and grief. And so having an understanding of that for your own self might just shed some light. So that link is there, but it will be shared as well. Without reading this forward, grief is often, and the duration and intensity of that grief is often influenced by your attachment style, how you were made, your family rhythm, the number of losses that you've seen, again, the nature of the relationship. I want to make sure there's not a question in the chat. Lauren, make sure. Does that come up? Okay.
No.
So we have to recognize that again, I think it helps us to see ourselves as a continuing story as opposed to one particular event. And disasters do bring us to places where it feels like it's all encompassing. And we often forget that we've walked through a whole heck of a lot before we even got to this point. So our reactions to that moment are influenced by all of those things that came before. And that's not, I think at times that could potentially feel maybe damning, but I think that it actually could give us a perspective on what you might need in order to show up in this moment in a new way. So if it is that extra text or a regular phone call with a friend, social support, by the way, is the number one way that we see symptoms of trauma and stress decrease. So those friends and that pet that you might have, all of those relationships in your life empower you to move forward, and they really do strengthen your capacity to enter in and lean in as you lead. And it's really important, as I said, grief is not a state, but it is a continuing journey. And I think that sometimes, even as we get farther away from an event, we think that folks have kind of gotten over it, so I would imagine that there are many of you that have experienced since the flood last year. The first few months were really intense and really hard, and probably even really positive in some ways as you watch the community come together. But that dissipated because, as it does. And then eventually it was just kind of about building it back together and fixing the roads and fixing the homes, and it became more of a long-term recovery stage. And people may not have been manifesting or exhibiting those behaviors that were linked to that acute grief originally, which, for us, we kind of move into, and I think, again, it's healthy. It's part of our resilience to move into a place of new rhythm and new joy and a sense of hope. But then when the second flood occurred, it wasn't just that it was this isolated flood, but we had just gotten out of this. And we just felt like we were healthy again. And now it happened again. And it's almost like we're right back where we started a year ago. And worse, we're depleted already because we've exerted energy to get us to a place of healing. Does this resonate with you all? By show of hands, or this isn't easy stuff, like I want to say that too, like this, it is a weighty time in our world and on a global scale, but also on a local scale. And I think that the reason I share this isn't to just kind of bang that or shake that storm cloud, but the intention is also to, how do I relate to the world and how do I relate to others with this knowledge? How does that impact my posture to kindness, to grace, to love, to creativity, and to hope? Because that human connection that we have empowers us to think of what could be possible. Yeah. Just to review the stages of grief. Sorry, forgive me. Stages meaning really linked to the way that behaviors are manifested, and important to remember. So we deny that things have happened. It's a common way of just removing ourselves from the situation and try to kind of get through it, and maybe not lean in. There is the anger and it's hard to be angry at the weather, because it isn't personal. Like there's not a human or an individual behind that, but this pulls us into anger at higher beings, or a sense of, even the greater humanity due to global warming, so there's lots of placement that we direct our anger toward. And then bargaining, obviously, with a sense of what if and if only scenarios, kind of going over in our head. If we had just reinforced that foundation, or if we have just checked on that person one more time, and that moves into a place of shame at times. And then it becomes, there are times where it becomes quite quiet and internalized in a sense of feeling overwhelmed. And then we move into acceptance. And acceptance, I think a lot of times can feel like it's supposed to be this happy place, like, okay, all is well and moving forward. But this is really where we move into what we call that integrated grief, where it is a part of our lives. We recognize that this occurred and there is opportunity moving forward. I loved this visual because it definitely, I think at times from even a clinical perspective, when I'm talking to some of our volunteers, like we expect it to look very clean, when in fact it moves. So this image on that realistic experience piece, it really resonates for me, because there's just days where it isn't clear or justified in our mind that we're experiencing these things, but yet we are. And it is to be expected. It is typical for grief to be recurring in our lives in different ways. I heard someone describe it as spurts of sadness at times, where there might just be a walk that you're on where you see something that cues you to think about that loss. This is all typical, and we share this experience. That's my point. It's like this is a shared typical response that we all walk through when we're navigating loss at that level. So what's important as we respond to disasters? We go back to psychological first aid in the most real way. Planning and preparation, active listening. We talked about compassion, providing a safe space, balance, self-care, stress management. It's important to exercise these muscles in times where there isn't an event, but it is also important to reinforce this in others when we are recovering from an event. That's why forums like this are so important for you all to connect and to engage with each other, and to ensure that you're holding each other accountable and taking care of yourselves. So, PTO, or time off, is the one that I emphasize a lot, where we might take a day off but are still connected. What does it look like for you to be disconnected off of the device but connected with other people in your time away? As we discussed, we're dealing with foundational issues from the pandemic, issues of climate and social civil unrest. Again, it's a hard reality that we are all facing and all sharing, which begets grace if we're kind enough to each other. When we think of circumstances of violence or immediate crisis moments, the first thing that we need to do is reestablish a sense of safety, control, and calm with one another, and promoting a sense of that self-efficacy and community efficacy that we all come together. I see this so beautifully in small towns, like many of yours, where there's just a sense of commitment to one another that is really unparalleled in some of the larger cities. There's just a sense of we can get through this and we can be connected. And things will work out because we are together in this. And these messages of hope are really helpful in navigating forward. How many of you have had the opportunity to take psychological first aid or have been exposed to that? Would highly recommend it if you haven't. And would love to just recommend that, it's a self-guided training you can take on the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network. I can share that link as well. But it's just a good reminder of what are the key essential components that we need to connect to one another and to ensure that we're operating from a place of humanity first. I want to pause for a second because this has been a lot of content. So I'd love to do a quick stretch break if that works for everybody. So you can feel free to turn off your screen. You can do this seated or you can do this standing, but I'd love for you to just reach your arms up above your head as high as you can, and then count with your fingers all the way to 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then push down with your hands, palms facing the ground, all the way down. Hands to your side now, just roll your shoulders back. Be aware of where the stress is, and stretch your neck out a little bit. And roll your head one way and the other. And then shake your arms out a little bit to reset. Okay. So yeah.
We did have a question in the chat. Is psychological first aid the same as mental health first aid?
It is not. That is a great question. Psychological first aid was developed by Patricia Watson and April Natural specifically to identify the psychological responses of crisis intervention. Mental health first aid it speaks to the kind of broader everyday interactions in caring for someone's mental health. So psychological first aid very focused on that intervention and crisis response, where mental health is a little bit more broad. Great question. Okay, so continuing in this, the elements of psychological first aid is the same as what we've been talking about this whole time, is to create a sense of safety, understand the basic needs of an individual and how you can help to solve problems, being intentional of validating feelings and thoughts, using phrases that empower people and acknowledge, as opposed to coming up against or stigmatizing, connecting people to their support system. So being involved in guiding people to the people that they love. And I use this almost every day in the way that I engage with my team. As a team, we are working in disaster response on a regular basis. So our rhythm is very much responsive, and that could be very dysregulating for folks. Providing accurate and timely information. I talk about how communication is so critical to our sense of efficacy, and knowing when we know something and know when we're going to get that next piece of information, it does decrease our stress response. Having moments like this where we provide education about stress reactions in work, and then reinforcing those positive coping strategies. Like these help us, even for ourselves, but for the people that we're caring for, know what a path forward can look like. As I said, words really do matter. We, even as we walk through things that may be a shared experience as a community, I know I don't have to tell you these things, but these phrases are, we have such a desire to want to fix and bring peace to a situation that might be stressful. These words can be incredibly polarizing and painful. So instead of saying all of this, I know what you're going through, you must be so, or at least he's at rest. Focus on the good. All the things that cause eye rolls. Lean in. Can you tell me more about what this has been for you? Most people have strong feelings when something like this happens to them. What has this been like for you? What's the hardest part? What sorts of things have you been thinking about since this took place? I think at times, when there is a pressure to say something, again, we look to try to resolve, but by doing that, we can cause some additional pain. Does anybody have an experience like this that they, would be willing to share or offer specific to the flood that y'all have walked through? Maybe that you heard somebody say something in response to it, in an effort to be kind, but it had the opposite effect. I would encourage, if you have had that experience, maybe thinking about what would have made it a more positive experience for you. And do you have the relationship capital to go back to that person and share that information? So this is all from SAMHSA when it comes to engaging in these moments of crisis. Clearly identify yourself and your role in the particular response. Your tone and your posture matters. I think some of us are type A, myself included, and so I often come into the room with a force, and that can be really off-putting. So before you enter the room, even when I'm talking at a work meeting, before you enter the room, take 5 seconds to regulate yourself and to check yourself and walk in with kindness. I at times visualize actually putting on like a shirt to help me engage a little bit differently. Be careful not to talk too fast. People are often really distressed in moments of crisis and disaster, and they can't take in information if we're moving too quickly, and be really clear with what you're saying. Don't speculate, don't try to package things up in euphemisms, but most importantly, to acknowledge the emotions of the people that you're working with. When you're asking questions of people, make them concrete. So instead of open-ended things of, how are you feeling today? Are you tired? Do you need water? Listen and allow for those emotional expressions or crying without interruption. So when someone starts to cry or show emotion, have a tissue, offer that support. But don't look to speed through that moment. Sometimes people just need it, you know? And I think this is really helpful too, is to make sure that we avoid in that kind of intervention and care place to avoid using examples from your own life to make things feel better. Like, oh, I went through this last year. I know exactly what you're feeling. It was so hard. You went through something last year, but that individual you're speaking to and with may not have gone through that exact thing, or they may be having a very different experience. And know the resources in your community that are available. Just want to do a quick chat check to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay.
Yeah. Paige Hartzell did suggest cultural competency is another important factor. And Liz Schlegel also said to the prompt you were asking earlier, there have definitely been folks who say, at least your town isn't as bad off as X, which Liz says does stink. Yeah.
What is exactly. So I think the question becomes in forums like this and in moments like this or in interactions, how do we avoid trying to almost compete, and I know that there's so many like political implications of what funding's available and how to, navigate all of that stuff. But how can we be kind to one another and recognizing that loss is loss is loss? Yeah, I see a hand raised. Feel free.
I have a question in relation to what you were just talking about when you're going in to respond and not comparing it to your own experience, but is there, I've found personally that when I'm going through hardship or grief, it has been helpful to hear that I'm not alone and that have that kind of relational piece. So is there a proper time for that? Maybe not in that first initial conversation, but what could that look like?
Yeah, so the key to that, I love that you bring that up. The key to that is relationship and permission, right? So you're right. In that initial conversation is what it's psychological first aid specifically speaks to. But when there is trust and relationship, there is that sense of being known by that other person, so that when it is shared, it's not coming from a place of just trying to level the playing field, but helping guide through. As part of that social support piece that we were talking about before. So, and there, like I said, it's not to say there's not a place for it, but that the foundation of relationship is key to ensuring that the use of that example isn't dismissive or diminishing of what that individual might be experiencing in that acute moment, if that makes sense. Great question. Any other questions on this before we move into self-care? Okay. So different categories of self-care. None of this is probably new to you. Maybe the creative one is. It was new to me when I first looked at this. We obviously talk about physical needs to be met, the sleeping, the eating, that movement and exercise, obviously mental, emotional. Am I exposing myself to too much social media, given all that's going on in the world? Social, am I hanging out with people that fill up versus take? Are there some toxic relationships in my life that are really pulling from my ability to function? My lifestyle choices, am I different rhythms of my life that I might need to take a look at? How's my bank account doing right now? And how am I aware of how to ensure that I'm safe and I'm okay on that front? But the creative part I thought was really interesting. So one of the things I love about Vermont as a state, but specifically, the smaller towns, I just feel like the folklore art component of y'all's culture is just such I'm growing up in the East Coast, loved going to Vermont just to see all the things you guys beautifully create. So how is there an outlet for you in drawing, in poetry, in music, in constructing or whittling or anything of that nature? I've seen some beautiful, even just stone towers that are put up as memorials. Is there a space for you to express creatively and to fill that outlet? I've even seen it on the kind of in the sports arena with people building strategies to win games. And then of course the spiritual component, whatever that looks like to you, making sure that there's some points of engagement on that front. There's this great book called Self-Compassion by Dr. Kristen Neff that ensuring that as we're walking through all that we're walking through right now, that we have a sense of compassion towards ourselves. And I think you hear about this a lot, that the parents tend to be the worst at this, moms in particular, we really beat up on ourselves for small failures. And I know I just talked about not sharing personal experiences, but I did want to share this. A lot of times there's financial stress around events like this, whether your organization is getting the right funding. I know that fundraising around this particular response has been harder than it was last year. All of the stress that comes. And at times, our greatest fear is linked to the resources that we do or do not have. And I just would like to share that there are times where you will not have enough money in the bank, but connecting with somebody in that moment of lacking and at times maybe even despair can give you a point of creativity and an opportunity that you may have missed. And I'll share this little vignette. Many years ago, I was running a very tiny nonprofit, and we had a cash flow challenge linked to a disaster event. And just by a kind of comedy of errors, 3 payments occurred before a wire arrived, and our bank went negative $4,000. Okay. My greatest fear as a financial leader, was that very thing, that we'd get negative and that things would bounce. But I tell you what, I woke up and opened the bank account, and that was the reality. It was 7:30 in the morning. 7:31 happened. 7:35 happened. 9 o'clock, And I realized that like this great fear of mine came down to a $15 fee, and nobody thought I was a failure. And to be released from that sense of shame on myself was one of the most freeing things that occurred to me as a human being in the world. And then to take it even further, once I felt freedom in that, I shared the story with people that I trusted, and they had gone through very similar things to me. And then all of a sudden, this light bulb went on like, man, we are just in our heads about how awful we are sometimes, or how the what ifs of what might possibly happen. But if we took some time to be kind to ourselves and anchoring and remembering who we are, and remembering that we share a sense of purpose and importance and value, even you, what freedom we would have to collaborate and problem solve without a sense of, well, what if this person thinks I can't do it? So just evaluating the sense of how you can move forward in a place of strength, in knowing who you are and knowing who cares for you, and remembering who holds the power in defining who you are. Because again, peace in that place allows for great strength in what's ahead. In a very similar fashion, just notice, pay attention to how you respond emotionally to things. Think of it like a wave and picture it coming and going. When you are angry, how does it swell, and how do you feel? What are the responses you have when it subsides? When you're afraid, and then remember that you are not how you feel, right? They are responses, they're not defining. Practice how to build around support when you do feel this emotion. And allow for your emotions be what it is. Like, you don't have to judge it. It's just what we can't often control how we respond emotionally. But having this practice of observing and remembering and loving, it allows us to be a little bit more peaceful when we are walking through the hard stuff. Here's some things I love, and these have come from dear friends and mentors on this journey of disaster work. So you are not alone. It's just true. And if that has to be the mantra that you speak over yourself for a time, let it be. Almost every thought, feeling, behavior is not bad, as long, obviously, as it's not illegal or self-destructive. Tears are a gift to us. You are loved and lovable even when you are confused and concerned. It is just true that there's discomfort when you're interacting with someone who is grieving. No matter how bad you feel, you will survive that next moment. Grief is exhausting. And as I mentioned, it doesn't ever really go away, but it may manifest differently as we walk through what we walk through. Okay, so we're at the top of the hour, but what I would like to do is I'd like to remember that pen and paper that I mentioned. I would love for you to take one of the things that you feel that you've had to experience in light of this sequential flooding, and I'd like you to write to it. It could be the loss of a pet, or a loss of a colleague's relationship. I'm going to give 5 minutes. You can feel free to go off screen for this. For those that need a bio break, it's a good time. And then we'll come back together if you're open to sharing, not the whole letter, but maybe what you wrote it to. Would love for that to be a place. But again, this is a safe space. So I'm going to actually unshare my screen for a moment and give you some space. Does everyone feel comfortable with the assignment? Okay, 5 minutes starting now. We get one more minute. Todd, I see your hand raised. I'm gonna go ahead. Okay. I'm going to pull us back together. I would love to be able to give a little bit of time back to your day. But is there anyone that would be willing to share what came to mind when writing this letter?
I would, please.
Go ahead. Todd. Yeah, thanks.
So I'm going back to the Irene flood in 2011. I was 8 months on the job. I barely knew what I was doing as a river management engineer. And I had the Rutland and Springfield offices. And it was sometime in February of 2012, I think, that I saw a map and I learned that my two districts were hit the worst. I had 3 people help me out on the Rutland side. I live on the Connecticut River side, and 2 people helped me out. No, 3 people helped me out over here. So it was a 5-year recovery, 5 years of chaos. I grew apart from my wife. Now we're in an imminent divorce next month. The feeling was that I have failed as a person. My last line is, but I am still an okay person. She failed our marriage, not me. Thank you. Could have used this years ago.
Thank you for sharing, Todd. We send our love to you. Anyone else that would love to share? Be open to sharing what you wrote your letter to.
God bless you, Todd, and good luck.
Thank you. She's doing me a favor.
Anyone else that would like to share? Oh, I think Teresa, are you talking? I'm sorry. You're muted though, if you are. No, it's all good. Okay, there you go.
Okay, can I do it now?
Yeah, ma'am.
Okay. It's the little things in life that make me happy. How to unmute myself.
Yeah.
Well, I came on to the job, and I'm not sure anybody knows me that's on here, but I got hired 3 days before the flood in 23. And I really had never worked in municipality. I worked as a property manager for Rural Edge. So I had some basic training on how to deal with properties. But I came into the flood in 23 and pulled my boots up and hit the ground running. And I have to say I was exhausted from it before this 24 flood. And on the day of the 24 flood, I had signed my last thing that I needed to sign for FEMA. And then we had the flood in 24. And I think what I've lost is a sense of security when I'm laying in bed at night and I hear rain. And it used to bring, I used to have this, what's the little box call that you can say to it, Alexa, play rain. And I used to do that every night, for quite a long time, a couple of years. I don't play rain anymore. In fact, it wakes me up and then I have a little bit of stress going on. Yeah. And that's one little bit of loss, but I get through that. That's pretty basic. And I think a lot of the townspeople express the same thing, you know. And so you can agree with them. Yes, I know what you're talking about because I've lost that sense of security when it rains. The other thing I feel like I've lost because I became the town administrator and very heavy involved in, the whole FEMA and helping the people in the community get through this, is I sort of lost the friendship I had with certain people in the community that I once had as just a layperson, just, another person, that lives in the community. Now I'm part of the team or the townspeople. And so you have it's a different way that people look at you or deal with you. You lose that sense of intimate friendship because you become, part of that leadership of the community. And if things don't go right or things can't go their way, then that friendship changes.
Yeah.
You become a different person. You're not that same, you don't have that same relationship. So you lose that relationship. I actually had a lot of losses this year. I lost a sister, lost a nephew. We lost, the community foundation of security here. So there's been a lot of loss this year.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it.
Thank you, Teresa, for sharing.
Sure.
I really appreciate that. Anyone else would like to?
So now
Awesome.
how do I go back to being muted?
I think, yeah, there you go. You did it. Great job. Anyone else would like to share?
I didn't have, my house didn't get affected by the flood this year, but my road did. And I kind of like zoomed out with my grief and just wrote about just the witnessing the loss, both in like my local community as well as the greater Vermont community, whether it's like the first time driving through that town that got hit really hard, or just seeing, the news, the photos and videos. I also felt, very similarly to Teresa, like that anxiety producing feeling of hearing the rain, which once was a very peaceful feeling for me. And, also just grieving the loss of safety, due to a changing climate. I think a lot of us have felt safe in Vermont, because we don't have wildfires and, a lot of other, things that other places deal with in relation to climate change. And now we are affected. And so that loss of safety feels hard. And then, zooming in, there's a bridge down the hill from my house that connects to a series of trails, and the bridge is gone. And so, I can hop across the brook now, but likely won't be able to walk there in the winter. And so, that's kind of feels like a small loss, but still impacted. And just observing the land changing, and the rivers changing, it almost brings a sense of awe in a way. Just, watching what happens when the water, pushes through. Yeah, thanks for letting me share.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, go ahead, Paige. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I really appreciate everyone's vulnerability and sharing like these really personal experiences that people have had with grieving and loss over the flooding. The one thing that I've really struggled with, I don't really know how to categorize it as a loss, maybe a loss of autonomy a little bit. With working for a nonprofit that relies so much on federal grants and not being able to take the time and the space during work days to help with flood recovery work because I couldn't get paid if I did that. And so had a few weeks of pulling 60, 70-hour weeks to try to keep working full time and also doing flood recovery work after work on the weekends. Started to impact my family, started to impact my mental health. And just how the hands of my organization were tied. It's not that they were saying you can't do that, but it's like it just is very complicated, to continue paying people if they're not actually doing the work that that is aligned with the grant that's paying their salary. So I really struggle with that, with money always being the bottom line, even when people really don't want it to be. And how that just comes into stark contrast with the acute needs of the people in our community. Yeah, and I'm just still trying to figure that one out and how to make it all work. It's really complicated, and and it has caused me a lot of grief.
I mean, loss of autonomy absolutely is something to hold, and I was recently in a meeting with a woman who's working with the Office of Management and Budget at the White House, and she's training all of the FEMA sites currently, the offices and regions across the country in trauma-informed disaster recovery. And we were doing a review of the content, and she mentioned how wonderful it would be if we had a trauma-informed government, which would extend to, and I think that it is worth advocating for, is what I would say. And I know that coming together as a community to do that, there's a lot of power in that, to be honest. So yeah, systems are, interestingly enough, the cruelest part of this process, I think, at times. Anyone else? Anybody have time maybe for one more person if someone else would like to share, but if not, we can move to any closing questions or comments. Yeah, go ahead, Jim. Thank you. Oh, I think you're still muted, Jim. I'm so sorry.
One of the things that's been very helpful for me is hearing the vocabulary and phraseology that you're using, because the basic concepts of what's being discussed, all of us have at least some experience, but maybe not enough.
Yeah.
And what is helpful is hearing your vocabulary, phrases, concepts that we can use then to re-articulate what we're learning today. And I mean, if we're going to spread the worth, so to speak, wealth, there you go, that's better. We need to know how to phrase things articulately and with compassion and whatnot. So thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely, Jim. Thank you for that feedback. I appreciate it. Thank you. We have 10 more minutes. But I am okay, because I do think that after a time like this, It is really important to step away. And so here's what I am going to encourage you to do, if I may, Lauren. Before I do, is there anything you'd like to close up with before I send us out with an exercise?
No, go ahead and send us out. And thank you all so much. And just a reminder that I will be sharing the recording for anybody who's shared who would like me not to share some piece of your story. Just let me know and I can edit it out, no problem. But you all have shared so beautifully. And I think so many people will resonate with what has been shared today. So I really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Yeah. All right. So here's my assignment to you all, my final parting one. Most of you probably either have an 11:30 or a 12. So whether you have an 11:30 or 12, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to get up out of your seat after we hang up. I'd like you to walk either to a place in your home that you love to be, or outside next to a plant or a tree or something that brings you joy. For those of you that are in a building, maybe it's just the oxygen of being outside itself. And I'd love you to do that box breathing that we talked about. And in the closing of that box breathing exercise, I'd like you to send a message to someone who matters to you, just letting them know that they matter. Okay. Yes, you asked for the PFA course. I will absolutely send that to you. Let me pull it up really quick. But does everyone understand the prompt? Okay, so copy this link, send it to you all in the chat here. This is self-guided, so you can feel free to take that. We also do tailored PFAs for organizations if that would ever be helpful. So please feel free to reach out if you need us. I'm going to put my email here in the chat if you would ever need to reach out. But grateful for all of you, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for the space.